The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
There are artists who perform for the world, and then there are those who quietly build the world that others perform in. Benny Andersson has always been the second kind. For decades, he sat slightly out of frame, behind the piano, behind the glass of the recording booth, behind the carefully constructed image of one of the greatest pop groups the world has ever known. While millions scream for ABBA, relatively few stop to truly ask, who is the man actually making this music? What drives him? What haunted him? And what has he been carrying quietly all these years? Now, at 78 years old, Benny Andersson is finally talking. Not in the carefully managed way that comes with press tours and album launches, but with the kind of honesty that only arrives when a person has lived long enough to stop being afraid of the truth. What he is sharing changes the story of ABBA in ways that are both surprising and, when you think about it, completely inevitable. Because if you ever listen closely, really closely, to those songs, you always sense that something deeper was going on beneath the surface. Something that didn't quite match the glittery costumes and the stadium smiles. This is that story. And it begins not in Stockholm or at Eurovision, but in the quiet interior of a boy who fell in love with music before he ever understood what love would cost him. Benny Andersson did not grow up dreaming of fame. That detail matters more than most people realize. While the entertainment industry is populated with individuals who have chased the spotlight since childhood, who rehearsed acceptance speeches in their bedroom mirrors, Benny was a different creature entirely. He grew up in Stockholm in the 1940s and 1950s, surrounded by the sounds of Swedish folk tradition, accordion music drifting through family gatherings, and the kind of communal singing that belonged to churches and kitchens rather than concert stages. His grandfather was a significant early influence, a folk musician who played with joy and without pretension. Music in Benny's childhood world was not a career path. It was simply a language, a way of communicating things that ordinary conversation couldn't reach. He absorbed this understanding before he could articulate it, and it shaped everything that came afterward. By his teenage years, Benny was playing in bands, notably the Hep Stars, who became one of Sweden's most popular groups in the 1960s. But even then, those who knew him noted something different about his relationship to performance. Where other musicians thrived on the roar of the crowd, Benny seemed most alive in the creative process itself. The writing, the arranging, the endless experimentation with chord structures and harmonic progressions. That was where he lived. The stage was almost secondary. This fundamental truth about Benny Andersson, that he was always more craftsman than showman, would define both his greatest achievements and his deepest struggles within ABBA. It made him irreplaceable. It also made him, at times, invisible. When Benny began his creative partnership with Björn Ulvaeus, something genuinely rare happened. Two musicians found a collaborative dynamic that was more than the sum of its parts. Benny brought the music, the chords, the arrangements, the emotional architecture of each song, while Björn contributed the lyrical narratives and storytelling instincts. Together, they operated like two hemispheres of the same creative brain. What Benny constructed in those recording sessions was far more sophisticated than casual listeners ever appreciated. He had an extraordinary gift for what musicians sometimes call emotional counterpoint, the art of placing musical tension precisely where it will have the most powerful psychological effect on the listener. Those ABBA songs that made people inexplicably want to cry even while dancing? That was Benny's doing. He embedded melancholy into the very harmonic structure of melodies that, on the surface, sounded jubilant. It was not accidental. It was architectural. He was also a forward-thinking studio innovator. At a time when many pop acts were content with straightforward arrangements, Benny was pushing into the emerging world of synthesizers and multi-track layering. He understood instinctively that the studio itself was an instrument, and he played it with the same intentionality he brought to the piano. The lush, cinematic quality that distinguished ABBA's recordings from their contemporaries was not the result of luck or budget. It was the result of Benny's relentless pursuit of a specific emotional texture. People close to the recording sessions have described Benny spending entire days on a single 8-bar section, not because he was a perfectionist in conventional sense, but because he was chasing something he could feel but not yet quite hear. He wasn't polishing for polish's sake. He was searching for honesty. He wanted each track to carry a genuine emotion, and he would not release it until it did. This obsessive dedication produced a body of work that has proven remarkably durable across half a century. The songs don't age the way most pop music does because they were never purely of their moment. They were built on something more fundamental, the basic human experience of love, loss, joy, and longing, expressed through Benny's particular genius for translating feeling into sound. Here is something that gets lost in the ABBA mythology. Benny Andersson rarely stood in the spotlight. Literally. In concert footage, he is typically positioned behind his keyboard, slightly back from the front of the stage. In photographs, he often appears at the edge of the frame or slightly behind the others. In interviews from the peak years, Agnetha and Frida commanded the attention, their beauty, their voices, their personal lives generating the headlines, while Benny and Bjorn occupied a more peripheral media position. For a man who had poured his soul into every song, this created a peculiar and quietly painful experience. He was the architect of an emotional landscape that moved millions of people to tears, to joy, to the kind of feeling they would remember for the rest of their lives. And yet the credit, the recognition, the simple act of being truly seen, largely bypassed him. Critics wrote about the singers. Fans screamed for the singers. The cultural conversation around ABBA was almost entirely framed around its two female members. Benny has recently spoken about how this felt, not with bitterness, but with a kind of tired candor. He understood the mechanics of the entertainment industry well enough to know that image drove coverage, and that the visual language of pop stardom favored faces rather than the hands working behind the scenes. But understanding the logic of something doesn't make it hurt any less. He knew what he had contributed. He knew the emotional depth he had built into those recordings. And he experienced the consistent frustration of watching that contribution go unacknowledged in the public narrative. What's particularly striking about his reflection on this period is that he doesn't frame it as rivalry or resentment toward his bandmates. He was not competing with Agnetha or Frida. They were doing their jobs, and doing them magnificently. His frustration was with the system, with the way fame operates, the way celebrity is constructed, the way popular culture tells stories about music by centering the most visually compelling figures and largely ignoring the creative infrastructure beneath them. He has said that he used to read reviews hoping someone would notice the structural complexity of the arrangements, the way he had layered instruments to create specific emotional effects, the risks he had taken with unconventional chord choices, the deliberate tension he had built into songs that seemed on the surface to be straightforward pop. Most reviews didn't engage with any of that. They talked about the hooks, the harmonies of the vocalists, the production sheen. The man who had created all of those things remained, in most tellings, a footnote. Benny's relationship with Annie Fridlingstad, known to the world as Frida, was one of the most significant of his life, and one of the most complicated. They were together for roughly a decade, including the years of ABBA's greatest commercial success, and their partnership operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Creative collaborators, romantic partners, bandmates navigating the extraordinary pressures of global fame. From the outside, it looked like a charmed life. Two talented people, deeply connected, creating music together while the world celebrated everything they made. But the reality that Benny now describes is considerably more nuanced and considerably more honest. He has spoken openly about the fact that he was always more emotionally present in the studio than he was in life. This is not a small confession. It speaks to something fundamental about how he was wired, the way music became not just a form of expression, but a form of regulation. When he sat down at the piano and began working through a chord progression, he could access feelings that otherwise seemed out of reach. The music gave him a container for emotion that direct conversation did not provide. Frida needed something different. She was by temperament and by history. She had survived a genuinely difficult early life marked by loss and displacement, someone who required real presence, direct connection, emotional availability from the people she loved. She gave fully of herself and needed that fullness returned. What she encountered instead was someone who gave his most honest feelings to songs rather than to conversations. Benny has reflected on this dynamic with remarkable clarity and with what sounds like genuine regret. He understands now that what he offered Frida, however sincere, was incomplete. He was present in the music. He was less present in the relationship. And when those are the same thing for a long enough period, the relationship eventually buckles under the weight of what is not being said. The songs that emerge from this period carry unmistakable emotional fingerprints of genuine pain and longing. Anyone who has ever listened carefully to the later ABBA catalog, the songs that arrived as the band's personal lives were fracturing, can hear that something real was being processed in the recording studio. These were not manufactured emotions designed to connect with audiences. They were authentic experiences being worked through in the only language Benny fully trusted. He has said, with the honesty that comes from decades of reflection, that he gave his best, most honest emotional expression to the music, rather than to the people who deserved to hear it directly. That is a profound admission. It reframes not just his relationship with Frida, but his entire approach to emotional life during those years. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, ABBA was operating under pressures that would have tested any group, let alone one composed of two couples whose personal relationships were simultaneously unraveling. The relentless pace of recording and touring, the weight of commercial expectations, the media scrutiny of their private lives, all of it was accumulating into something that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. But Benny's account of what was happening from the inside is different from the dramatic narrative that popular culture tends to prefer. There was no single explosive confrontation, no watershed moment of irreparable rupture. What he describes is something slower and in some ways more difficult, a gradual draining away of the authentic creative energy that had made the whole enterprise worth doing in the first place. He has spoken about a specific shift he felt in the studio, a moment when he realized that what they were producing no longer felt true in the way it once had. The music was technically accomplished. It was commercially successful. But something essential had gone out of it. The emotional urgency that had driven those early sessions, the feeling that they were making something that mattered beyond the charts, that had faded, and Benny couldn't will it back into existence. What kept him there, he admits, was not passion but obligation. He felt responsible for the music, for the people whose livelihoods depended on ABBA's continued operation, for fans who had invested something real in this group. He stayed out of duty and guilt rather than genuine creative excitement. And he believes now that this is visible in the later work, in retrospect, that the absence of that original urgency left its mark. The end, when it came, arrived not with a dramatic declaration, but with a quiet mutual understanding that there was nothing left to sustain. The four members went their separate ways without, as Benny remembers it, ever really sitting down to talk about what had happened or what they had meant to each other through it all. There was no formal farewell, no collective processing of everything they had shared and built and lost together. Just a gradual dispersal into individual lives. This absence of closure, or perhaps more accurately, this particular form of closure that is not really closure at all, stayed with Benny for years. He moved forward. He built a new creative life. But something unresolved lingered in ways he didn't fully understand until much later.